Welcome back and to Make It Conscious. This is Max, and this is a series on the future of work. So if you watched the last episode, that was all about sharing various tips and tricks about how you can actually know your unique set of facts. So what I mean about that is things that apply to you that you enjoy doing, that you're good at doing, that will allow you ultimately to contribute and move and adapt and transform along with the changing nature of work, which is quite clearly changing rapidly before our eyes right now, not least with the invention of AI and various other technologies that are just transforming the world of work, not least changing attitudes to, well, remote working and also to authority generally. And as Hegel said, history is the progression of the consciousness of freedom. And I think that's what's playing out here. Yeah, that's what played out during the pandemic. That's what played out during all the major changes we've seen in technology in the world of work. So just to serve as a reminder of where we are here, I'm talking about, generally speaking, sort of two extreme approaches to the world of work. And I've illustrated that on the slides for those who are watching on video. One is what I would call the starving artist trope. Someone who just does whatever they fancy, moment to moment, just follows their whims, believes they're going out into the stream life where they can just do what they want all the time, and yet of course is met with the pretty obvious self-contradiction of that, and is met with their own limitation in doing so by paying no credence to the other side of this dialectic, which is of course to meet the needs of the world. Because if you're not serving anyone, you're not contributing anything, how on earth are you going to be able to extract economic energy from the system? I mean, you might be able to do it here and there. You might be able to find little loopholes, little hacks. You could try all kinds of things, but you're never free of the consequences of self-contradiction. You're entirely free, and that's precisely why consequences occur, because limitation is created by your own actions. And so therefore, there is this need to also meet the needs of the world. But if that's all you're doing, then you're not even an individual, right? You're just basically a piece of biological machinery, just doing whatever someone else is telling you to do or expects of you. Why? Maybe because it's easy, maybe because it's more comfortable in the short term, maybe because you can't be bothered to reflect or take a leap or to take a chance. Maybe, to be fair to you, you have no inspiration for that. You don't know anyone else who's done it. You've not seen any meaningful examples. Like, this is really important, is to have not only examples, but also mentors to show you that it's possible. So these are the two extremes we're talking about. And in the last episode, we focused more on the first one, although I talked more about like the practical ways in which you can actually know who you are in an intellectual sense, at that like factual way, using psychology, using symbolism as well, using tarot and things like personality type. And so today we're going to be talking more about the other side, that is how to actually meet the needs of the world. And this is quite a fun topic, because this is where a lot of people like to hang out. This is where a lot of digital marketers hang out. This is where you get trained on how to do what's working now. And I find that a really challenging phrase, because what will always work is to undergo this process, right? Is to know yourself and contribute in the way that you best can. That's what will work. Anything else is just an expedient hack for producing the appearance of results at the expense of the real thing. Because if you're having to deceive people to get what you want, so to speak, is that not a complete self-contradiction? Can you not see how that's obviously going to break down sooner or later? But nonetheless, this is a fun topic, because it's really about like taking action, doing things that work ultimately, and making things happen in the world, and understanding how you specifically can actually do that. Because anyone can follow a formula, anyone can follow a method. Why should you follow that method? What is it about you, other than the fact that you just kind of like the idea, or there's a projection going on where you've fallen in love with the guy that's teaching it, or whatever? You're a Tony Robbins fan and you just do what he says. But to that end, there's something very practical about this. Now, for those who are watching a video, you'll see a quote that's just appeared. This was a piece of wisdom that was duly imparted to me back in 2013 from Pete Smith at BT. So shout out to you, Pete Smith, wherever you are. There's probably about 100 Pete Smiths at BT. So I doubt you'll be receiving lots of phone calls from this video, but hopefully you don't mind me sharing your wisdom with the world, because what Pete Smith said to me was, it's a lot easier to meet demand than to create demand. And he's absolutely right to an extent, because everything is true to an extent. But when we're just talking about meeting the needs of the world, this is a really important thing to bear in mind, because I think we can all recognize the sort of trope of someone who opens up, say, a gift card store, an independent sort of little shop in a major city or town high street, and is out of business within 3 years. I mean, that's someone who's trying to create demand for something. But if you can recognize an existing demand for something, whatever it is, you can build a business based on that. I'm not suggesting you do that and you only do that. This is hopefully clear by now, because to the extent this is not true, this kind of advice taken unilaterally can be very dangerous. Why? Well, because anyone can meet demand. If there's demand for something very specific, then you know there's going to be other sellers in that industry, that market, or that niche who are also trying to fulfill that demand. But the key, of course, is in differentiating within the niche. And that's when you stand out. That's when you're basically meeting a bit of demand, but you're also being more authentic within that, in principle, unless you're just differentiating for the sake of it, which sadly is what a lot of products do or have to do until they move beyond that in their psychology. But as a kind of rule, like if you're new to business or you haven't started a business before, or maybe you're young and you're wondering what to do with your life, this is very, very useful. And if you can demonstrate a demand for anything, whether it's a certain kind of course, something you know about, whether it's a certain kind of product that people need, then this is a pretty old school way of approaching it. But if you just simply analyze the supply and demand, and if you see a lot of demand and a little bit less of a supply, then that usually means there's an opportunity there. So I mentioned a couple of episodes ago that I launched an Amazon business back in about 2014, actually about a year after this was said to me, probably by no coincidence, because what ended up happening was, well, the products that we launched that I actually thought was going to be the worst performer actually ended up becoming the best performer. And the reason for that was that even though there were fewer sales in that particular, let's call it a niche, there was also a lot less supply. So there are very few serious Amazon sellers in that niche. And so we launched a product thinking, it won't do especially well because there aren't as many sales in that niche. But what we underestimated was how valuable it was to actually just do basic things like present your product well, launch it properly, advertise it properly, and that counted for a lot. So we became number one seller for quite some time in that market. This was actually a little later than I mentioned because I did some other stuff in between then, but at some point around 2017, we became number one in that niche as well, all because we decided to meet demand, but also to not enter a place where there was an oversupply. And so rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, a lot of business operates pretty much on this basis. It just tries to meet demand. It goes, where is there a demand? How can I meet it? But of course, that's just one side of the dialectic. You cannot just stop there because it wouldn't be self-knowledge. You'd just be fighting, competing in a great, pit of hostile commercial shenanigans. It's not fun. That's not individuation. But the idea of meeting demand is a factor you have to consider. You can't just be like the starving artist who just does what they want all the time and follows their whims, because that's not freedom either. Let's move on. So thank you, Pete Smith from BT. So I'm going to share just some practical prompts now. Like I did in the last episode, we're going to do the same now for how you can actually do a bit of self-inquiry and understand how you specifically can meet the needs of the world, what you can do. So simply ask that question. What can I do? How can I help? What can I contribute? You can do this at your desk with a piece of paper. You can also do this in active imagination. You can follow the usual technique for that. You can use some guided exercises, actually. Anything relating to discs from the tarot is a good one to do here. Maybe even some of the zodiac signs like Capricorn, Virgo, or Taurus would all be good ones to do here. There's another topic here around nature of jobs. What does it mean to have a job? And is a job really the way to contribute? And the answer is yes, sometimes, of course. There's nothing wrong with having a job. But a job in itself, and it always gets me when I hear politicians or whoever talking about how, oh, this is going to create more jobs, or it's going to cause the loss of jobs, or how new technology is going to cause the loss of jobs, and we need to make more jobs. And it's completely misguided, because a job is not a unit of good. A job is essentially a transaction. It's basically an expectation or a contract around what is essentially contribution. But at some metaphysical level, when we're talking about you becoming uncontradictory in yourself, it doesn't actually matter whether that's contracted or, of course, practically speaking, there's going to be contracts involved, whether that's through an employment contract, or whether that's through a sale contract or a consultancy contract, or whatever it is. You need contracts, sure. But these aren't the point in themselves. These are actually reflections of a deeper energetic exchange that's going on. And so it's really about becoming non-contradictory yourself, as I've reiterated many times in many videos. Because ultimately, whether you're acting like the starving artist on one end, whether you're acting just like this corporate wage slave on the other side, you're going to become self-contradictory if you hang out with either of those two for long enough or to a sufficient extreme. And well, the idea is to actually become self-contradictory. So we're all contradictory to an extent. We're all partial. But the name of the game of the self-knowledge journey is to find those contradictions and straighten them out. And so a job might be a way of doing that, if that's a way of you actually contributing. But see, one of the challenges with this idea of like getting a job is that it confuses the means with the ends. And in doing so, it also thinks of it in terms of, okay, what can I get out of it? But the only reason you ever get anything out of it is because someone's willing to pay you to do it. I mean, this is basic economics, right? You can't get a job for anything unless someone else is willing to pay you for that thing. Just like when you're buying a product, every purchase is also a sale. Every sale is also a purchase. So if you're just thinking about it in terms of what do I get, we talked about Adam Smith a couple of episodes ago and the invisible hand concept. That can take you so far, and it can take a culture so far, as we've seen. But it too starts to break down at the edges. So it's worth actually training yourself to be more aware of this and think about this more. Like, not only what am I getting here, what am I actually also doing for this other person? And if any of you have ever hired someone, or which I'm sure many of you have, or you ever made a really large purchase, have you ever done that? Have you ever made a really large purchase or hired someone and seen their life change as a result? That's quite a significant thing when you first notice that. Like, not only how you get the outcome that you wanted, but also how you see that actually affecting the rest of the world around you as well. This is why it's generative. This is why generosity, we're going to talk about that some more too, is so important, because you give one, they give one, and you both get two, right? You actually create something out of it. So some more little prompts here. What does your mind want to do when it's stuck in something mindless or repetitive or robotic? Where does your mind go? Does it go towards any particular idea or industry or philosophy, particular subject? Does it do a particular kind of thing? Does it act out a particular kind of function? Do you start getting insights into things? Do you start coming up with little lessons, things you're learning, insights into human nature or society? Do you start thinking about what you're going to cook tonight? Do you start thinking about your friends, your family, different people, how you feel about them? Does it make you want to get up and run around? I tend to find that if my mind is being pulled towards something, it's usually a pretty good clue as to what I should be doing. Sometimes, of course, that's just by going around our days, the mind is going to move, it's going to get busier, it's going to start producing externalities, right? This is just the shadow dialectic. As the mind moves and as it becomes directed on anything, other things get pushed aside and they then have to come up again. And so it creates momentum, and that plays out, and that's why thoughts will appear randomly often. And one thing that makes us distinctly human is that we're actually able to do that. We're able to direct our minds, but we're also able to consciously tidy up again afterwards. So not every thought has to be chased, but if there's something that is filling you with inspiration and passion, don't get ahead of yourself. Don't go nuts necessarily, but just understand that might be pointing you towards something. I remember in one of the first jobs I had after graduating from university, there was a short period where this was happening to me, and no matter what I did, these thoughts just kept appearing in my mind. I was at work, and I had to write them down, and I opened up an email account and just sort of wrote emails to myself because I thought I've got to write this stuff down. And it was partly due to dissatisfaction from the job and aspects of my own unconscious that were calling for my attention, that were showing me that I had to be thinking bigger picture and thinking about the kinds of stuff that I'm sharing with you now. So, it's a pretty useful thing to be aware of when it comes to understanding what you can actually offer, because it usually points you in the direction of something productive. Okay, next one. What is the thing that would not be the same without me? Wow, this is a big one. That's where you want to get to, because if it's the same without you, or if you're just a replaceable cog in the machine, then by default, you haven't fully differentiated yourself. To differentiate yourself means to become partial, but it also means to be different, to be self-expressive in some way. So is there something in your life right now? It might not be a job. We already talked about jobs. It might not even be work related, but that doesn't mean that you're not contributing. One of the key lessons of this whole habit 4 of my 7 habits model, is that contribution is not just something you do through the formal arrangement of work. That can facilitate, but it can also be a trap as well. It can actually also prevent you from genuinely contributing, not least if that's the only place you actually offer any value to anyone, but also if it's misdirects you into thinking that that's the only place you can actually offer value. So maybe this is something around family, something you do for your family, something you create artistically that people value. And if people do value it, but you're not getting paid for it, then there's a case to be made for finding a way to get paid for it. Not charging just whatever you can get away with necessarily, because that's not an integrated approach, but charging what it's worth and charging what you need to charge in order to live the kind of life you need to live. So next one, how could I both live a vocational existence and raise a family simultaneously? Now, I don't know if you noticed, but these things appear to be a little bit mutually exclusive in the world today. And it doesn't have to be that way. I tend to think that where there's a will, there's a way. And there's many people who manage to pull this off. But sadly for many, it seems to be a choice of one or the other. And for my generation, the millennial generation, we don't necessarily have many good examples of people who have done this well, especially from our own generation. So if you look at our peers and our colleagues at work, generally speaking, they're often not raising a family. And it's an almost unquestioned sort of assertion that, yeah, you can kind of do one or the other. Or, oh, look, women in the workplace aren't having families, and this is one of the reasons why they get paid less, is because they have families and so on. Yeah, okay. But how many of us are actually questioning that? How many are actually questioning whether this is how things really need to be? How many of us are actually looking at recent history and seeing how it used to be? Or even just putting ourselves in our parents' shoes. There's a kind of meme going around that is really a data point talking about the average age at which women had their first child. And I think the data I've seen is actually for the UK. And there's a gradual decline, i.e. women were getting pregnant earlier and giving birth earlier, until about 1971, at which point the average age of the first child was 23 point something. And from 1971, it gradually started rising until around 2018, it was over 28 was the average age that a woman had their first child. This is a drastic change over less than 50 years. And what's causing that? And what impact is that going to have? Well, one theory is that the financial system changed in a huge way in 1971, and make of that what you will. That was the year that President Nixon took the US dollar off the gold standard. Of course, we're talking about a UK set of data here, but the two countries tend to mirror each other to a large degree. This is something that's happened all over the Western world. The point is, I think, not so much the exact timing of it, but the fact that women are having children later, and that implies that it's getting more difficult in some way. And it's pretty conceivable to think that one reason for that might be that in some ways life is getting a lot more expensive in terms of purchasing power. Now, there's all kinds of data that seem to challenge that, but a lot of that is very debatable for many reasons. I've even discussed some in the previous series here around like the fact that houses are getting more expensive, they're getting smaller. So the average house today is not the same as the average house in 1980. And one reason for this is simply the amount of debt in the system. Everything's getting more expensive, partly because debt is increasing, especially in the USA. And so you're basically all having to pay for things that you're not receiving the value from, largely. And that's another thesis that's going to have to change at some point. It is already changing. But it's going to take people to actually question and take matters into their own hands in terms of taking responsibility for their mind. And if you want to have a vocational existence and raise a family, if you've done that, great. I'd love to hear from you. Comment down below. If that's something you aspire to and you're thinking that you might have to choose one or the other, that's a great tension to be working with. That itself is also a dialectic, and there's a middle way in there that I think will emerge if you don't give up on that tension and hang out with it and work with it. So next one here, how do I feel, how do you feel in the presence of someone who is ahead of you in some skill? Do you feel inspired? If you really regard yourself as a great guitar player, for example, maybe you meet someone who is in many ways better than you. They're more experienced, they're more fluid, they're faster, they're more accurate, they make fewer mistakes, whatever it is. How does it make you feel? Do you feel inspired? Or do you feel turned off? Or maybe you feel a bit of both. So in any case, that can be a real clue as to what you're being drawn towards, what your self is directing you towards. If you just feel completely turned off, that can also suggest that maybe there's something in the act of playing guitar that needs to be channeled, but maybe that's not the way to do it. Whatever it is, maybe it's a certain archetype that's coming to the surface, or maybe it's some personal aspect around attention that need to be seen a certain way, that need to draw a crowd, have eyes on you, that need to be admired. And if you feel turned off when you encounter someone who is more proficient than you at anything, is it showing you to look a bit deeper? Like, what's the real reason I'm practicing this skill? What's the real motivation behind it? There's many layers to that. So you can dig and dig and dig. On the other hand, what if you feel inspired? Is this showing you what's possible and what is the right direction for you? Maybe not forever, maybe for the next year or a few years or something. Maybe you feel both. Now, this is not too hard to get your head around. Maybe there's some kind of shadow dynamic there. Maybe you're trying to sort of make sense of what it is you're experiencing. Are you experiencing something inspiring on one hand, and that might be the antidote that you're seeing? This is something that's in the shadow, but some people call this the light shadow. So you find it inspiring because it's precisely what you need to actually realize your own conscious aims. But at the same time, there might be aspects of the shadow in there as well, mixed in, or the shadow position. And you might be seeing something genuinely unwholesome there. Like you might be seeing someone who is undeniably like a bit of a show-off, right? Maybe they're doing it purely because they don't really care about the music really, and maybe some part of you senses that. And maybe they do a bit, but primarily as a means to maybe getting attention or having status. And some part of you might well be picking up on that. And hey, maybe there's a bit of you that's like that too. So it might be actually a concoction of both light and dark qualities, and maybe you're drawn to some and turned off by others. So if you're feeling both, that often implies there's some kind of shadow dynamic going on there. But if you just feel completely turned off, then, that's not necessarily purely just your own projection. Okay, so next one's then, what roles are fulfilled by people with similar birth charts and or personality types? So let's start with personality types. I mentioned in the previous episode that I'm currently in research and development mode, and I'm releasing a new tool for personality type. It's based in Jungian psychology. It's based on Jungian type. And so basically it uses archetypes to illustrate the various types and the various functions that you use, the mind uses. So, for example, someone who is very organized externally is possibly led by what I would call the commander archetype. So this is someone who likes to be very logical internally as well as externally, but in particular, they're using logic to build things in the world or to do what makes sense in the world in terms of getting results. And on the other hand, they might be using, say, introverted sensing. So I would call that the stalwart archetype. And this is someone who is very in tune with what's been done before. They have a great memory, and they're very familiar with tradition. They're drawn to their own inner sensory experience, which includes memory. So they trust tried and tested methods. So what do people with the commander stalwart combination, what do they do in the world? And that can give you some great clues. Like a lot of them might make great managers of other people, systemizers, but especially those who can facilitate existing systems and build a business, but maybe act as a kind of an operations chief or director, someone who is maybe like the right-hand man who is there to execute on the plan laid out by someone who's more intuitive, perhaps. Or they might be some kind of inspector. They might be very, very good at laying down the law and laying down standards, making sure that people adhere to certain standards of quality or certain regulations. And so this can certainly give you some pretty useful material to work with. But it doesn't tell you what you must do, but it just gives you some ideas and gives you confidence that maybe that's something you can do as well. And likewise, so people who share your symbolic aspects. This one's a bit trickier because it's not prescriptive. Neither of them are prescriptive, but this one even less so. However, it can help you see how those forces that are at play might play out for you as well. So for example, in the Tarot Birth Chart service that I offer, I actually will give you a list of people who share your purpose card. And that's a card you share with less than 3% of people. So that can give you some pretty good ideas. I mean, by nature, a lot of them are famous people. They're all famous people. But I usually include a mix in there from various walks of life. And so you can see like what themes tend to be shared by them. So I'm just going to reel off a quick example here. So a number of people who share the same purpose card would be Donald Trump, Jordan Peterson, and what's his name? Edward Snowden. Three guys who would appear very different on the surface, right? Except for the fact that they all, symbolically at least, and in their own way, are associated with truth. So Edward Snowden, pretty obvious one, right? Is all about bringing truth to the world. He was the guy that was a whistleblower at the NSA and told the world that they were snooping on people's data. Jordan Peterson, of course, plays a similar kind of role. I believe he sees himself as very much a truth speaker, and he's saying things that, at least in the mainstream, weren't really being said much. And lastly, Donald Trump. All I will say about Donald Trump is that he has a platform called Truth Social. So again, these symbols aren't predicting anything. They're not determining whether you use these symbols in an ethical way, whether you adhere to the wholesome aspect, whether you actually speak truth or not. That's not what this is saying. What this is saying is that, like, symbolically, this is something that's showing up. And it can literally appear in a platform called Truth Social, for example, or it can appear in terms of your behavior, in the case of Edward Snowden. So this all gives insight into what you can actually contribute and ultimately get paid for it, because there's nothing wrong with that. Next one then, let's move on. what is the right amount to charge? So this is something that is very rarely said, and it's surprising how many actual coaching offerings or people who are in the helping professions even will actually tell you basically to just charge what you can. Whether they tell you that explicitly, whether they believe in the idea of the invisible hand to an extreme extent, of course you should charge what you need to charge. You should be able to build a business, a respectable business that makes profit, that not only contributes great value, but also gets paid and paid well for doing that. But that's different from trying to charge what you can. And so if you subscribe to the capitalistic view, the Adam Smith view, that's basically income, money, whatever the metric, is pretty much a linear measure of some kind of goodness. And therefore, if you just maximize that thing, then the rest will come out in the wash. You're doing good. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about all the other factors. They will all sort themselves out. Just make money and the jobs are good. But we don't have to look very far to see the problems associated with that. So there's a big difference between charging what you should, like that middle ground between what you're worth and also what people are willing to pay, versus just trying to get away with charging what you can. When I think about this, I often think about the changing state of the high street in the Western world. Like in my home country, the UK, over the last 15 years, it's completely transformed. So the old school high street stores, things like Woolworths, right? It was a famous store where you could basically go and buy just odds and ends and household goods and vinyl and pick and mix and music and all these different things. They folded eventually, and they just were consumed by online competitors. But also the fact that rents are going up. And one reason for that, of course, is the state of the financial system, which we've been talking about off and on. So what this has led to is a different kind of business forming on the high street. And we're seeing this change too now. I remember when I lived in London for a good number of years, me and some friends would meet up every weekend, and we'd always go to the same cafe. We'd work out and then we'd hang out for a few hours on a Sunday usually, and go to our favorite little Greasy Spoon cafe in East London. And it was great. It was good value. It was like easygoing. And it was basically the only place in that area that still operated in that way. We also like to go to these other places that are a bit fancier. We still do that occasionally when I'm there. But as like a weekly thing, we just went to this no frills little place here, did good food. And yeah, we all loved it. So eventually, after a number of years, that place eventually also succumbed to this wave of gentrification that spread across London. And it was a sad moment where we all kind of anticipated, but it was inevitable. And so what we're seeing in a lot of these other places, some of them, yeah, that they also offer great value, but they tend to conflate value and income and revenue with the mere perception of value. So a lot of brands, a lot of businesses really abuse the nature of brand trust and the nature of perceptions. They basically try to make something appear more valuable than it is. And of course, there is some innate value to simply how something makes you feel. Like there is real value in that. And many economists, probably Adam Smith included, would say or presume that if someone is willing to pay for it, what's the problem? I mean, there's all kinds of problems. I mean, firstly, because the idea of a rational decision maker is pretty precarious, I think. I mean, it's clearly not true. Like people clearly don't make rational decisions all the time in the economy. The second reason is that, well, simply because deception is real, deception is a thing. If you were to say that basically whatever you do, you just do because you decided to do it, and even when you make a bad decision, or even when someone lies to you or deceives you in any way, I mean, you're basically just saying that no one else can do anything harmful to you. It's all your own fault, which is self-contradictory in itself, because inevitably that person doesn't like it very much when someone does the same to them. So there's a lot of attempts, like more than ever, I think, to try to create the perception of value where there isn't any. This is not going to lead to self-knowledge. I mean, it will when it finally comes crashing down and an individual chooses to work with the fallout and work through that tension. But if they constantly just try to avoid it, that kind of behavior is only going to lead them away from a genuine self-realization. So let's move on then. Next one, am I working for open or closed? This is a reference to the blog post by Seth Godin. Brilliant post by him from many years ago. I read it a few episodes ago. I suggest you search it and go and read it if you're interested. And essentially, he's talking about two kinds of business and two kinds of attitude to business. One which is moving things forward and remaining open and willingness to change and helping people to grow. And the other one which seeks to profit from ignorance and keep people under control and keep people naive and unknowing in order to gain some perceived benefit. And of course, it really is a perceived benefit, because all that does is appease and placate the need for resolution in oneself. It doesn't actually achieve a progress. It might produce the appearance of it. So on a similar theme, am I helping people move towards truth or towards confusion? So again, if you, like many of these folks who just believe or act as though they believe that if you just make profit or revenue, then that's enough. Well, of course, if you double down on that as the point, then it doesn't matter what falls by the wayside in pursuit of that. If other people come to some kind of harm, or they get more ignorant as a result, they get misled, what does it matter? The number's going up. So on a similar theme then, am I truly helping others, or am I helping them to do something harmful? So I think of people who work in, say, certain training courses around making money online. There's nothing wrong with that. I make money online. But there's certain kinds of these systems that really are actually teaching techniques that are actually really dishonest. And so something I've noticed is that people who have made a lot of money doing exactly that, maybe like these old affiliate marketing folks, not all of them were great guys, it has to be said. And so they made a lot of money doing that, maybe millions and millions. And clearly some part of their conscience, like you can see it, that there's a lot of guilt there, and they're oblivious to it themselves, but quite clearly they're trying to work with that. And so they open up some kind of training program, and accompanied by the obligatory spin around how they're now helping people to get themselves out of a situation. And really what they're doing is they're teaching these people to do basically what they did, but convincing themselves that they're now doing a good thing because they're now, quote unquote, helping others. But they're actually helping others to commit further moral transgressions. So if you're helping others to harm people, are you really helping people? Some will no doubt think that you are, and some will feel that you are and say that you are. Doesn't make it true. So I love a good Seth Godin quote, and he once famously said that in a free market for attention, someone is always racing to the bottom. So I love this quote, and where this applies here is simply that, well, look, meeting the needs of the world doesn't mean pleasing everybody. It cannot mean that. And if the market is really for attention, you're going to sell yourself short. Not only that, but you're going to completely lack any differentiation. Attention is not the idea. Like getting approval, getting mass customers as opposed to the right customers, none of that is the point. And again, if you regard that as, or getting just any customer or getting any amount of some metric, whether it's attention, whether it's likes, whether it's subscribers, whether it's profit, revenue, turnover, none of that is the point. And so even though this is a really key component, this need to meet the needs of the world, and it's a very powerful and productive and fun topic. It really does make results in the world. But if it's taken in isolation, you end up being the most loud, brash, and attention seeker. So that's not the aim here either. So then, we're coming towards the end of this episode. I'm reaching the time limit, but given the practical nature of this particular episode, I want to share something with you that I've discussed before in other contexts. And this was a really concise, useful little business/sales tip that was imparted to me by another senior member of an organization that I once worked for. And he said, there's only 3 things you got to think about. And those are quality, quantity, and direction. or sometimes I reorder them: quantity, quality, and direction. So quantity, how much you're doing; quality, how well you're doing it; and direction, where you're focusing your energy. So these are all things that you have some degree of control over, in some cases, complete control over. So you can control within certain limits how much you're doing, how often you show up, how many calls you make, how many meetings you have. That's quantity. And so often, if your livelihood or your business is not getting off the ground, or you don't feel that you're in the right place, maybe this is one of the problem areas, or maybe you're just not showing up enough. And there's a lot to be said for that. Now, this too has a dark side, of course, but equally, not showing up has a dark side. So are you actually doing enough? Because you see, the reason this breaks down is because if you're not really showing up, you see, there's again a kind of self-contradiction in that. Because what's the message you're sending yourself, your mind, and the world in doing that? The message you're sending really is that I want something, I want to contribute, I want to receive value for this, but I also sort of expect it to happen for me. So you can think of this in a very rational way. Like, yeah, obviously the more you turn up, the more you're going to get from that thing, sure. And what gets measured gets managed. You can control that to some degree. But also thinking about it philosophically or even psychospiritually, what's the actual conflict? What's the message you're sending if you don't show up? It's really that you expect something to come. This is a form of entitlement. So showing up and showing up enough, not only is it really important, but it's something you can actually manage. And so in sales, they talk about sales funnels. It's like, well, if you need to make one sale, you better have 4 people that you're talking to. You better have at least 3 or 4 qualified opportunities that you're working on. And in order to have 3 or 4 qualified opportunities, you need to have maybe 10 or 15 leads. In order to have 10 or 15 leads, you need to have maybe 50 conversations or 100 conversations. Who knows? It depends on the business, but the point is pretty clear. And that can be applied to any pursuit, even non-work related stuff, but certainly any business or any venture or any contribution that you wish to give. This is a really important factor to bear in mind. Secondly, quality. So how well you're executing. This is something you have a great control over too, of course. You can improve this by sharpening the saw, by learning, by practicing. But that's also the key, is that by simply showing up, to quite a large extent, you naturally get better at something anyway. There's more conscious effort that needs to be applied there, of course, and self-reflection and doing things right and putting actual effort in moment to moment. This too has a dark side, because you can really like torture yourself if you really just try and work at full pelt every moment. That's not the way to do it either. There has to be a pacing in these things. There has to be a relaxation to every project, every contribution you try to make. But that said, it does happen naturally too. And if, say, you're showing up a lot, but you're not getting the results, or maybe it's how you're showing up is partly the problem. Maybe you're not performing well. Maybe that's because it's not the right thing. This can be really useful feedback to you as well. If you've been trying this thing for years and it's still not working out, then maybe there's a case for a bit of direction here. So the third piece here is direction. And this is simply where you're focusing your energy or what you're focusing on. And so when this was told to me, this was actually the biggest takeaway of the 3. Again, there's a kind of spiritual underpinning to this, because what you actually focus on doesn't only change your own mind, it also changes what appears. And so if you actively choose to focus on a certain kind of project or a certain kind of customer, that's where your energy will go. And so the key takeaway here is, do not just indiscriminately do anything. You have to be very, very discerning. You have to be saying no a lot more than you say yes. And this is something that seems to become ever more true as time goes on, as the individuation process goes on, and as you develop greater self-knowledge. It's at least as much about saying no as it is about saying yes to people, to opportunities, to ways of being, right? This is all about sacrifice ultimately. But you see, there's freedom in sacrifice. That's the point. That's one of the key points of Christianity, right? It's the value of sacrifice. So given the time, I am going to leave that there. So I hope you found that useful. This has been another episode in this Future of Work series. There's so much more to explore here, so much more I want to think about and talk about. And so I'll thank you for your time and attention. And also just let you know, I'm going to be dropping these to bi-weekly for a time. So as I mentioned, I'm in R&D mode right now. I'm developing something new and I need to make more time for writing because I just simply haven't been posting enough blog posts lately. And there's so much more I want to say. And I think that will actually also inform my videos as well. So I plan to do a little bit of that and like writing and then talking about what I've written on this particular subject. So thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.